Welcome to this e-learning module, The Gaze, produced by the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Minnesota. This work is licensed under a Creative Commons, Attribution, Non-Commercial, Share-alike 4.0 International License. When you complete this module, you should be able to define the male gaze, the white gaze, and the oppositional gaze. You will learn that there is power in viewing gendered and racialized bodies, on screen or off. For a fuller discussion of the imperial gaze, see the Empire module in this series. In this module, we will be looking at feminist theories of the male gaze, and several important ways in which this concept has been complicated and extended. Feminist scholars begin with the assumption that the act of viewing is never neutral, because it is premised upon a relationship of inequality that always contains the possibility of exploitation and objectification. The power that comes with the gaze is not simply negative, however, for it is also central to shaping how we understand ourselves. The power that comes with the gaze is not simply negative, however, for it is also central to shaping the way we understand and make sense of ourselves. In that sense, there is a lot at stake in being an audience member or spectator of media and a participant and voyeur in our day-to-day lives. Laura Mulvey famously introduced the idea of the male gaze in her 1975 essay entitled Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. We will start by looking at how Mulvey defined the term, since it provides the foundation for future feminist scholarship on these issues. Using mainstream cinema as her reference point, Mulvey makes the provocative argument that men are positioned as the viewing subjects, those who do the looking, while women appear as objects of the gaze, those who are looked at. As a result, the female body is constantly put on display and offered up for visual consumption. This excerpt from Mulvey's essay, entitled Woman as Image, Man as Bearer of the Look, captures these central points. Quote, "In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female form, which is styled accordingly. In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact, so that they can be said to connote to-be-looked-atness. Women displayed as sexual objects is the leitmotif of erotic spectacle. From pin-ups to striptease, from Ziegfeld to Busby Berkeley, she holds the look, plays to, and signifies male desire. Mainstream film neatly combined spectacle and narrative." End quote. Have you noticed the way women are portrayed in media, such as advertising, TV, movies, novels, and music videos? What comes to mind when you think about women's sexuality in the media? The presence of a woman is an indispensable element of spectacle in normal narrative film. Yet her visual presence tends to work against the development of a storyline, to freeze the flow of action in moments of erotic contemplation. As Bud Bodisher has put it, quote, "What counts is what the heroine provokes, or rather what she represents. She is the one, or rather the love or fear she inspires in the hero, or else the concern he feels for her, who makes him act the way he does. In herself, the woman has not the slightest importance." End quote. Traditionally, the woman has functioned on two levels: as erotic object for characters within the screen story, and as erotic object for spectator within the auditorium, with a shifting tension between looks on either side of the screen. A woman performs within the narrative. The gaze of the spectator and that of the male characters in the film are neatly combined without breaking narrative verisimilitude. Mulvey argues that the eroticization of women on screen has consequences off screen. Viewers are encouraged to objectify women just as the leading man does in the film. In an essay titled The Oppositional Gaze, Black Female Spectators, Bell Hooks argues that feminist theories of the gaze assume a white male viewer, and have consequently failed to take into account the different positions from which viewing takes place. In order to understand Hooks' critique, we must understand that the gaze refers to an objectifying structure of viewing and consuming a sexualized body. Mulvey argues that men hold the power of the gaze while viewing women on screen. Hooks complicates Mulvey's argument by stating two important points. Not all women are objectified in the same ways, and marginalized audiences can have what she calls an oppositional gaze. The oppositional gaze does not grant the viewer the same type of power as the dominant gaze, but it helps the viewer resist the objectifying ways they are represented in the media. Think about how the following passage from Hooks's essay challenges Mulvey's argument. When most black people in the United States first had the opportunity to look at film and television, they did so fully aware that mass media was a system of knowledge and power, reproducing and maintaining white supremacy. To stare at the television, or mainstream movies, was to engage its images, was to engage its negation of black representation. It was the oppositional black gaze that responded to these looking relations by developing independent black cinema. Within my family's southern black working-class home, located in a racially segregated neighborhood, watching television was one way to develop critical spectatorship. Unless you went to work in the white world, across the tracks, you learned to look at white people by staring at them on the screen." End quote. Hooks challenges Mulvey's assumption that all viewing is about objectifying women's bodies. She shows that viewers can have oppositional readings of media, forming different opinions, insights, and analyses about the programming than the producers intended. The oppositional gaze in this instance does not grant black viewers with the power to objectify white people on screen. The dominant gaze reinforces the dominance of our social worlds. Black audiences saw themselves on television as either caricatures or nowhere at all. The oppositional gaze responds to these representations. The oppositional gaze responds to these representations, resists their power, and shapes critical viewership. Further, Mulvey's emphasis on how white women's bodies are sexualized ignores the ways black women's bodies are sexualized differently. Archetypes of black women's sexuality, such as the Jezebel and the Mammy, have been perpetuated through television and film as well. These figures present black women as either docile and caring, the Mammy, or over-sexual and threatening to white women's propriety, the Jezebel. Patricia Hill Collins elaborates the importance of focusing on how the gaze is racialized as well as sexualized. Quote, "Created to justify the economic exploitation of house slaves and sustained to explain black women's long-standing restriction to domestic service, the Mammy image represents the normative yardstick used to evaluate all black women's behavior. Even though she may be well-loved and may wield considerable authority in her white family, the Mammy still knows her place as obedient servant." End quote. The Mammy is an asexual figure, maternal, subservient, and lacking any sexuality. Quote, "An unsuitable sexual partner for white men." End quote. The Jezebel figure, however, is quite the opposite. Hill Collins explains, quote, "Jezebel's function was to relegate all black women to the category of sexually aggressive women, thus providing a powerful rationale for the widespread sexual assaults by white men reported by black slave women." End quote. Jezebel's sexuality is represented as out of control, and these representations help to define normal or proper sexuality. White women's sexuality should, in contrast, be available yet restrained, heterosexual, not for sale, and monogamous. Mulvey's argument about the gaze uses examples of white actresses to state that women in film are objects of male voyeurism. When we think critically about race, however, we can see that viewing white women's bodies as objects of sexual desire informs the ways that women of color are represented as well. While Mulvey's argument about the male gaze upon white women has had profound influence in feminist studies, ignoring how women of color's bodies are gazed upon by both the male gaze and the white gaze leaves other questions of power unanswered. Now let's look more closely at how heterosexuality functions in Mulvey's analysis. To begin, her theory of the male gaze assumes that only men take pleasure in gazing at women's bodies, and that, as viewers, women have only conflicted ways of relating to female characters on screen. Turning to an example from the art world will help us think through these assumptions and further explore how sexuality and desire intersect with the gaze. In 1988, Robert Mapplethorpe, a white gay artist, published a collection of photographs of black men entitled Black Book. Here are a few images from the series. Cultural critic Cobina Mercer responded to Mapplethorpe's collection by pointing out that, although highly stylized, these images tap into a set of racist discourses that align black men with animality, hypersexuality, and savagery. Mercer argues that the photographs do not enter a neutral terrain of representation, but one where black male sexuality is already determined to be excessive and violent. Because Mapplethorpe's artwork cannot be divorced from the history that precedes it, his photographs ultimately cite and reaffirm a set of racialized anxieties. Let's consider the following image with Mercer's critique in mind. In this photograph, the model's sexuality literally spills out of his business suit, suggesting that black male sexuality is so excessive that it cannot be contained by dressing up. Moreover, the suit is made of cheap polyester, further marking the ways in which black men perpetually fail to perform the ideal of bourgeoisie masculinity. This leads Mercer to argue that such an image is premised upon a series of racialized oppositions, including nature, culture, savage, civilized, and body-mind. To refer to these dichotomies as racialized marks how the hierarchical relationship between them, or the way in which the first term is seen as inferior to the second, is anchored upon racial difference. This means that whiteness is always associated with the privileged term of the binary: culture, civilization, and the mind. Commenting on this piece, Mercer notes, quote, "The use of framing and scale emphasizes the sheer size of the big black penis. By virtue of the purely formal device of scale, Mapplethorpe summons up from the political unconscious one of the deepest mythological fears in the supremacist imagination, namely the belief that all black men have monstrously huge willies," end quote. Historically, white males eliminated the overwhelming anxiety which black male sexuality is constantly constructed to incite through rituals of aggression and negation in which the lynching of black American men routinely involved the literal castration of the other's strange fruit, end quote. An image such as man in a polyester suit is complicit with a material history of violence that has played out on the bodies of black men. This representation is powerful and perhaps dangerous in evoking that history. A few years later, Mercer came back to the controversy over the Black Book and reconsidered his initial response to it. In particular, he was interested in thinking further about how Mapplethorpe's photographs circulate within different contexts, and how their meanings get transformed as a result. Mercer uses his own conflicted relationship to these photographs to expose the multiple levels at which power operates. At one level, Mercer emphasizes the deeply exploitative othering of black masculinity that is perpetuated by these representations. At the same time, however, his gaze intersects with the objectifying lens of Mapplethorpe's camera, and the pleasure that is derived from it. For Mercer, this insight complicates his earlier reading, and for us, it throws into question an understanding of the gaze premised upon clear distinctions between subject and object. Quote, "Once I acknowledge my own implication in the image reservoir as a gay subject, as a desiring subject for whom the aestheticized object of the look represents an object choice already there in my own fantasies, then I am forced to confront an unwelcome fact that as a spectator, I actually inhabit the same position in the fantasy of master, which I said earlier was that of the hegemonic white male subject," end quote. In this example, Mercer identifies with both the object and the subject of the look. An attention to race and sexuality therefore complicates the ability to separate those who look from those who are looked at, those who have power from those who are objectified, those who occupy a position of mastery from those who are subordinate, and the list goes on. Engaging with the complexity of pleasure and desire is productive precisely because it opens up different possibilities for subversion and resistance. Take the following music video by Benny Benassi, for example. On the one hand, this can be read as a pretty straightforward demonstration of Mulvey's argument, and the power that is enacted through the objectification of women's bodies. However, as we have learned throughout this module, the meaning of a work does not solely reside with the author, but is dependent upon the context and the audience. If we take into account that this video is a constant favorite at gay bars, does our reading change? How is the male gaze challenged by this reappropriation? What kinds of meanings, desires, and pleasure circulate here? This does not mean that the misogyny of the video disappears, or that a queer gaze simply erases exploitation. But looking for these moments suggests that dominant structures of power can be challenged and disrupted. Here are the references for this module. You can download a copy of these references by clicking anywhere on this screen. We invite you to cite and share this module, and have provided a citation formatted for this purpose. To cite this module, please use the following APA citation.